The desert did not forgive mechanical vanity. In the spring of 1943, on the cracked flats west of Medjez el Bab, American officers of 2 Corps stood in the ochre heat, watching a column of British Churchill tanks crawl across the wadi. Their engines roared like steam locomotives, treads grinding deep furrows in the sand. It was not a pretty sight. The tanks advanced ponderously, coughing black smoke, their crews half-baked inside armoured ovens. One colonel muttered that the machines looked like brick outhouses on tracks. Another, from the armoured force board, took notes in a small green notebook, too slow, too heavy, too clumsy for modern manoeuvre warfare. The Churchill had entered the war under a curse of bad timing, conceived in the panic days of 1940, when Britain feared invasion and dreamed of refighting the trenches of 1918. It was a throwback, an infantry tank, designed to crawl behind foot soldiers and crush wire under its treads. In a war that now moved by blitzkrieg, that concept looked antique. The Americans, whose M4 Sherman was already proving swift and dependable, saw in the Churchill only what they had vowed to avoid: a mechanical dinosaur chained to the pace of infantry boots. The first Churchills arrived in North Africa in late 1942 with the British First Army. They were early Mark III and IV variants, steel boxes powered by a lumbering 350 horsepower Bedford twin 6-engine 2 truck engines bolted together. In the Atlas Mountains, they gasped for air. Crews joked that to climb a hill required divine intercession and half a can of oil per mile. Mechanical failures were epidemic: broken final drives, seized transmissions, cracked track pins. The 56-ton monsters could barely keep up with the fuel convoys that fed them. American observers, invited by the British to study combined arms methods, wrote home unimpressed. A report from the U.S. Army Observer Mission Algiers, December 1942, stated bluntly, "The Churchill, while heavily armoured, suffers from extremely low mobility and limited mechanical reliability. Its use appears confined to deliberate assaults, unsuited for exploitation." General Jacob Devers, chief of the armoured force, read that report in Washington and underlined the last phrase twice. He was already skeptical of heavy tanks. The United States had experimented with the 57-ton M6, but by 1943 it was an orphan. Devers ordered the program cancelled that December. "Speed and numbers win wars," he told his staff, "not ponderous machines." The desert battles seemed to prove him right. The U.S. 1st Armoured Division's M3S and early M4S raced across open ground, cutting behind retreating Axis forces while British infantry tanks lagged miles behind. American doctrine, forged at Fort Knox and validated at Rhine, declared the tank a weapon of manoeuvre, fast, versatile, and cheap enough to be built by the thousands. Anything else was a liability, yet the verdict was not universal. Among British engineers and a handful of U.S. observers who had seen the Churchill under different circumstances fighting in the mountains near Longstop Hill or clawing through the rubble of Tunis, there was grudging admiration. The tank's armour was thick enough to shrug off 50mm shells that shredded Shermans. Its narrow hull could cross trenches and climb cliffs no other tank could attempt. "She's ugly as sin," one British captain wrote, "but when the shells start coming, you'd rather be in a Churchill than praying beside one." The British, chastened by early mechanical failures, refused to abandon the design. In the back workshops of Vauxhall Motors in Luton and the experimental bridging establishment in Christchurch, Dorset, a quiet transformation began. Engineers stripped the tank to its bones and rebuilt it for siege warfare. The powerful but awkward side doors became ideal portals for flamethrower plumbing and demolition charges. The cavernous hull, derided by Americans as wasted space, became a laboratory for special equipment: bridge layers, mine flail prototypes, demolition mortars. In 1943, as American industry perfected the fast standardized Sherman, British workshops birthed a secret family of misfits under the eccentric genius of Major General Percy Hobart. His 79th Armoured Division would become known as Hobart's Funnies machines, designed not for manoeuvre, but for breaching impossibilities. Among them, the Churchill Crocodile, its 400-gallon armoured trailer of pressurized fuel, would be the most feared. None of this was yet visible to the Americans. In Tunis, General Omar Bradley visited a British tank park that summer and politely inspected a row of repaired Churchills. "Too slow for our boys," he said. "We'll stick with Shermans." His liaison officer noted that British mechanics carried oil cans and spare track pins everywhere, as if each tank were a chronic invalid. The evaluation was sound by the numbers. The Churchill's 15 man's top speed and short range looked absurd beside the Sherman's 24 miles per hour and 120 miles on a tank of fuel. But the numbers missed something that would matter later, the sheer stubbornness built into the Churchill's frame. When the Allies turned toward Europe, that stubbornness would find its purpose. The U.S. Army's rejection of heavy armor left a gap no one yet recognized: how to breach concrete. American planners assumed air power and artillery would shatter the Atlantic Wall. They were wrong. The British, haunted by memories of Dieppe, had already drawn a harsher conclusion that some defences could be killed only at muzzle range. The Churchill, slow but unkillable, was their answer. Through 1943, under security orders marked Most Secret Special Equipment, teams at the Ministry of Supply tested the Crocodile flamethrower at Ashley Walk Range. The system replaced the Hull machine gun with a projector capable of hurling liquid fire over 100 yards. The trailer, armoured, self-sealing, linked by a flexible pipe, carried enough thickened fuel for 81-second bursts. Crews trained behind barbed perimeters, their manuals printed under false titles to mislead spies. The codename Crocodile was chosen precisely because it meant nothing. Meanwhile, American armoured doctrine crystallized in print. The Field Manual 17-10, Employment of Armoured Units, issued July 1943, stated, "Heavy tanks are undesirable for the rapid offensive operations characteristic of modern warfare." The manual never mentioned flame tanks at all. In the annals of the armoured force, the Churchill was already a dead idea. By year's end, however, reports from Sicily hinted at a contradiction. British Churchill units of the 21st and 25th Tank Brigades had clawed up the steep approaches to the Etna line where Sherman stalled. German records later recovered by the U.S. Army's Historical Division noted with respect, the English heavy tanks proved exceedingly difficult to destroy. Hits to the running gear were ineffective. Only direct penetration of the engine compartment rendered them immobile. Still, American analysts dismissed the lessons. To them, the future was light and fast. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyer, the M24 Chaffee, a war of pursuit, not entrenchment. In their planning maps, Europe was open country. Across the Channel, the British were planning for the opposite. The Directorate of Tank Designs, minutes for November 1943, recorded a stark observation. Our American allies seek mobility. We seek access. Their tanks may reach the beach first. Ours may get off it. By the time the snow melted in the Ardennes 6 months later, that difference would decide who could burn the enemy out of his bunkers. The Americans, who had laughed at the Churchill's plodding gait and its appetite for oil, would soon send urgent cables northward. Request flame tanks for assault on fortified positions. British type, preferred. The rejected tank was waiting. In secret depots near Portsmouth, crocodiles sat in rows under tarpaulins, engines idling like beasts behind a cage. What the U.S. Army had once judged obsolete would become, before the year was out, its most terrifying ally. On the Dorset coast, in a restricted area marked Danger, Live Flame Experiments, the future of siege warfare roared to life. The Churchill Crocodile project had moved from drawing boards at Vauxhall Motors to the firing ranges of Ashley Walk, where teams of Royal Engineers and chemical warfare experts learned the alchemy of controlled fire. The secret weapon that the Americans had dismissed as an impractical oddity was becoming something altogether different, an instrument of psychological warfare. The Crocodile's creation was part engineering, part audacity. The idea had come from Major J.M. Oke of the Petroleum Warfare Department, a civilian chemist turned ordnance innovator. In early 1943, Oke met with Major General Percy Hobart, commander of the newly formed 79th Armoured Division, to propose a flame projector that could be mounted on the existing Churchill 7 chassis. Hobart, who had been disgraced and sidelined earlier in the war for his unorthodox ideas, instantly recognized the potential. "We shall make the enemy fear the ground itself," he told Oke. "The tank that breathes fire must be seen, not merely imagined." The first trials were primitive. Engineers fitted a Churchill's hull machine gun aperture with a short nozzle connected to an armoured pipe leading to a towed fuel trailer. The trailer held 400 gallons of thickened gasoline, pressurized with nitrogen to propel the flaming mixture over 100 yards. A small igniter at the muzzle created a continuous tongue of fire, hissing and twisting like a living creature. Early tests were unpredictable. Flame arcs collapsed, fuel leaked, igniters misfired, but the principle worked. British Army film unit cameras captured one of the first successful firings. A single burst reduced a wooden blockhouse to ashes in seconds. Observers in steel helmets, standing 100 yards away, felt the heat on their faces. "It was like looking into the mouth of hell," one technician wrote. Secrecy was absolute. All documents were stamped most secret flamethrower equipment, Type C. The crews, drawn from experienced Churchill regiments, were briefed under oath and warned that discussing the weapon outside the training ground was punishable under wartime security law. The Crocodile designation itself was code. Official paperwork referred only to Churchill, Special. Even within the 79th Armoured Division, knowledge was compartmentalized. Each regiment trained on one specialized funny, whether amphibious, mine-flailing, or flame-throwing, but never the full suite. "We knew we were preparing for something enormous." A driver from the 141st Regiment, Royal Armoured Corps, later recalled, "But none of us knew quite what." Behind the technical work lay a new philosophy of combat. Hobart's engineers were not designing a tank for tank duels. They were building a psychological weapon. Studies from the North African campaign had shown that German infantry, well dug in and disciplined under artillery bombardment, broke instantly when confronted by fire. A single flame burst across a bunker slit could force immediate surrender. The Petroleum Warfare Department calculated that one Crocodile, used properly, could neutralize an entire strongpoint network. It was not destruction that mattered, but terror. The technology evolved quickly. The original short-range projector was replaced with the No. 2 Merc 1 flame gun, capable of projecting a jet of liquid fire up to 120 yards. The trailer, a two-wheel armored cylinder, was connected to the tank by a quick-release coupling, a safeguard allowing the crew to jettison it if hit. Nitrogen bottles pressurized the fuel line, while a secondary valve prevented backflash. The entire system could deliver 81-second bursts, each capable of engulfing a pillbox or trench line. In tests, the heat reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to crack concrete and consume oxygen in enclosed spaces. Engineers faced one critical challenge: ensuring the Crocodile could fight like an ordinary tank when the flamethrower was not needed. Hobart insisted that the 75mm gun remain fully functional. The Crocodile therefore became a dual-purpose machine flame projector in the hull, cannon in the turret. It could blast and burn in the same minute, a flexibility no previous assault tank possessed. By late 1943, production was underway at ROF Glasgow and Vauxhall's Luton Works. Each conversion required 3 weeks and 300 man-hours. The Ministry of Supply's internal memo from November listed 250 Crocodiles scheduled for issue before summer 1944, with half earmarked for the 79th Armoured Division and the rest for cooperative operations with U.S. forces as required. Few Americans knew what those words meant. Training at East Wretham Airfield revealed the Crocodile's moral impact. In one demonstration for senior officers, a Churchill approached a derelict farmhouse rigged as a mock German bunker. At 50 yards, The projector hissed, and a river of flame engulfed the structure. When the fire died, only a smoking shell remained. General Montgomery, present that afternoon, said quietly, "That will do." The observers, among them several American liaison officers, were less composed. "God help whoever's on the receiving end," one murmured. The British colonel beside him replied evenly, "That's rather the idea." The Crocodile's first secret deployment came during the rehearsals for Operation Overlord. Under the cover story of smoke projection vehicles, flame tanks were shipped to the southern coast and stored in fenced compounds. Their crews trained at night, their fuel trailers hidden under camouflage nets. Manuals were printed in small numbers and kept in locked chests aboard transport ships. Only a handful of US officers, liaisons to the British 21st Army Group, were briefed on the Crocodile's true capabilities. They would remember them later, at Brest, Aachen, and the Hürtgen forest. By the start of 1944, the Churchill Crocodile was no longer an experiment. It was a finished weapon, a tank the Americans had once dismissed as obsolete, now reborn as an instrument of strategic fear. The British planned to unleash it on the Atlantic Wall, where fire would do what shells and courage could not. And when the Allies crossed the Channel, the U.S. Army, still wedded to its fast, agile Shermans, would discover that sometimes victory required something heavier, slower, and far more terrifying. The coastal wind off the Atlantic carried the smell of salt and cordite as American troops crouched among the ruins of Brest. What had once been a Breton port town was now a labyrinth of shattered stone, pillboxes, and steel-reinforced tunnels, a fortress city built for the Kriegsmarine's U-boats. Every street ended in fire. Every window hid a machine gun. By the second week of September 1944, the US V-8 Corps, commanded by General Troy Middleton, had been battering Brest for 21 days. Artillery pounded day and night, yet the German garrison, under General Hermann Bernhard Ramke, held on inside the granite bunkers of the port. The 2nd, 8th, and 29th Infantry Divisions had fought through towns before, but Brest was different. Here, the walls themselves fought back. An after-action report from the 8th Infantry bluntly summarized the problem. Our 105 seconds and 155 seconds cannot breach these casemates. The enemy remains functional even after direct hits. Infantry attacks against embrasures are suicidal. One sergeant described a bunker as a mountain with a machine gun inside it. Every assault ended the same way: flamethrowers expended, Bangalore torpedoes blown, men cut down in the killing zones between the pillboxes. The Americans needed something that could not only survive a fortress but destroy one. The answer arrived in a convoy of low-loader trailers marked British Army, special equipment. They carried squat, soot-streaked tanks with thick armor and strange cylindrical trailers hitched behind them. When the first one rumbled into the American sector outside Lambezelec, men stopped what they were doing to stare. "What in hell is that thing?" a GI asked. The British sergeant in command grinned. "That, mate, is your new best friend. We call her the Crocodile." The British 141st Regiment, Royal Armoured Corps, nicknamed the Buffs, had brought a detachment of Churchill Crocodiles across the Channel in August. They had fought in Normandy, reducing German strongpoints in Caen and the Falaise pocket. Now they were seconded to the US. 8 Corps, their orders classified, assist in the reduction of fortified positions at Brest. The first joint assault took place on September 7, near Fort Montbury, a massive 19th-century bastion turned German citadel. American infantry had been pinned for 2 days by crossfire from its concrete galleries. At 1,400 hours, under smoke cover, 2 Crocodiles advanced with the 121st Infantry Regiment, US. Observers recorded what followed with disbelief. The Churchills, moving at barely 6 miles per hour, took position within 80 yards of the fort. One tank's hull gun hissed, and a jet of orange flame shot across the moat, washing over the embrasures. German fire ceased instantly. Within seconds, white flags appeared from the firing slits. A captured soldier later told his interrogators, "We could not breathe, the fire sucked the air from the chamber. We thought the next burst would come inside." A platoon from the 29th Division, watching from a nearby ridge, reported. The effect was instant surrender. We'd been throwing shells for days, but it took one blast of Calorone, that stuff, to make them quit. By nightfall, word had spread through 8 Corps. The British had a flame tank that made Germans surrender faster than any artillery. Requests poured in, "Send the Crocs to our sector." For the first time, American officers who had once dismissed the Churchill as obsolete began to see its purpose. In Brest, the Crocodiles proved their worth not by body count but by fear. Army Signal Corps photographs show American infantry advancing behind them, rifles lowered, faces turned away from the heat. German prisoners described the flame weapon as inhuman. One officer from the 2nd Parachute Division later testified, "Our bunkers could resist every gun, but not the fire. It was the weapon of nightmares." A field report from 8 Corps G2 intelligence summarized the effect. Enemy morale deteriorates rapidly in presence of flame tanks. Resistance often ceases before physical destruction of position. Operational statistics confirmed the pattern. In sectors where Crocodiles supported infantry, the average time to clear a bunker dropped from 6 hours to 30 minutes. Casualties among assault platoons fell by more than half. Ammunition expenditure decreased. Surrender rates soared. Yet the tanks themselves paid a price. Their speed made them easy artillery targets, and the fuel trailers, though armoured, were magnets for enemy fire. One Crocodile was hit by an 88mm shell near Fort Kerenru. The crew survived, the tank did not. Witnesses recalled a column of black smoke rising 100 feet high. "Hell itself burned that day," an American private wrote. The cooperation between British Crocodile crews and American infantry was uneasy at first. Language, slang, and tactics differed. Americans preferred speed, the British, methodical advance. But within days, mutual respect grew. A U.S. captain from the 8th Division wrote in his diary, "Those Churchills move like turtles, but they don't die. And when they spit, you thank God they're on your side." Major R.L. Bowen of the 141st RAC described the Americans as reckless but brave beyond reason. They'd charge through gaps we'd call impassable. But they learned to wait for our fire before going in. The Croc opens the door. The Yanks kick it in. When Brest finally fell on the 19th of September 1944, after 43 days of combat, the cost had been enormous. 10,000 German prisoners, thousands of casualties on both sides, the city reduced to rubble. But the fortress had been broken, not by heavy artillery or air power alone, but by a handful of slow, despised British tanks breathing fire. General Middleton, in his final report, noted dryly, "The specialized British tanks proved of marked assistance in reduction of fortified points. Their further employment is strongly recommended." The U.S. Army had found its secret weapon not in its own factories, but in the machine it had once rejected as too heavy, too slow, and too foreign. At Brest, the Churchill Crocodile had turned flame into strategy, terror into surrender, and disbelief into doctrine. The lesson was simple, and it burned itself into the memory of every soldier who saw it. In the ruins of a fortress city, speed meant nothing. Only fire could open the way. By late September 1944, the Allied advance had reached the threshold of Germany itself. What awaited them was not open country, but a fortress line, the Westwall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line. Stretching from the Swiss border to the Dutch frontier, it was a labyrinth of 25,000 bunkers, dragon's teeth, and interlocking fields of fire. American intelligence officers had dismissed it as propaganda, a defensive relic. They were wrong when the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies struck its teeth near Aachen and the Hürtgen forest. The Westwall bit back hard. American Sherman crews found their guns too light, their armor too thin, and their courage tested beyond endurance. German infantry, entrenched in reinforced pillboxes with 3-meter concrete roofs, withstood days of shelling. Engineers blew gaps only to be cut down by machine gun fire from adjacent casemates. The 1st Infantry Division reported losing 1,100 men in 5 days at Aachen's outer line. "We can pound the bunkers flat," one officer wrote, but they keep shooting from the rubble. Then came the message from Corps headquarters. British 79th Armoured to attach Crocodile troop to US sector for evaluation. The 141st Regiment, Royal Armoured Corps, the same buffs who had burned out Brest, arrived near Aachen in the second week of October. They were weary, their tanks scorched and dented from France, but their trailers were freshly filled with fuel thickened by latex and gasoline. American GIs gathered to watch the strange tanks being unloaded. Looked like something out of a nightmare, Sergeant Harold Davis of the 18th Infantry recalled. A big steel beast with a barrel of gas dragging behind it. The Crocodiles joined the 16th Infantry Regiment for an assault on Pillbox 115, a concrete knot in the line near Vercelaine that had resisted for 2 days. Rain turned the ground to soup, the Crocodiles bogged down repeatedly, but they kept moving slow, unstoppable. Under covering fire, one tank eased to within 70 yards of the bunker. Its projector spat once. A river of flame poured through the embrasure. German fire ceased immediately. 2 minutes later, 12 soldiers stumbled out, hands high, faces blackened. The US, after action report, stated, "Bunker neutralized in 4 minutes. No friendly casualties. Recommend further use of flame tanks against concrete positions." Word spread quickly. American battalions that had never seen a Crocodile before began requesting them by name. Send the Crocs. Infantrymen followed the tanks like pilgrims following saints. When the Crocodile moved, they moved. When it stopped, they dropped behind it. You could feel the heat even behind cover, Private Sam Brooks of the 9th Infantry wrote. But when that fire came, you knew nobody in that bunker was coming back out shooting. Psychological reports from captured Germans painted the same picture. The Crocodile broke more men than it killed. A Wehrmacht NCO interrogated near Stolberg said, "Against your tanks we fight, against the fire we run." Another, from the 49th Infantry Regiment, described the sensation inside a pillbox. "It is as if the air is sucked away. You cannot breathe, you cannot think." US engineers began recording quantitative data. Colonel James C. Roberts of the 1st Army's Assault Training Center compiled a study comparing methods of bunker reduction. Without Crocodile, average assault time 65 minutes, 9 casualties per bunker. With Crocodile, average assault time 11 minutes, 2 casualties per bunker. Even the most skeptical armor officers had to concede. The rejected British tank had solved the one problem the American doctrine of speed could not: concrete. In November, as the front shifted south toward the Hürtgen forest, Crocodiles were again attached to US units, this time to the 28th and 4th Infantry Divisions. The terrain was hell itself: rain-soaked woods, mines, and hidden bunkers dug into the slopes. Shermans could not maneuver, artillery could not see through the trees. The Crocodiles, low-geared and heavily armoured, advanced like bulldozers through mud that swallowed jeeps whole. At Vossenack, one Crocodile led an assault up a logging road under machine gun fire. The crew later reported their hull temperature reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit inside. "We were cooking ourselves," driver Tom Whittle said, but the tank kept going. When they reached the first bunker line, the projector fired 3 bursts. The German defenders surrendered without a shot. American engineers, following behind, used flame from the Crocodile to ignite brush, clearing hidden mines. Even when the tanks ran out of fuel, their reputation did the work. Several bunkers surrendered merely at the sight of the armoured trailer. By winter 1944, British and American soldiers had forged an unlikely brotherhood through shared fire. They ate together, fought together, and buried each other under the same frozen mud. "The Crocs saved hundreds of our boys," wrote Captain John Forsyth of the 8th Infantry. "We started off calling them crazy Brits with gas wagons. By December, we were calling them angels." The cooperation went beyond tactics. Ordnance officers began studying the Crocodile system in detail. Technical notes from the Engineer Board, European Theatre of Operations, describe efforts to replicate the fuel-thickening compound and ignition system for future US designs. The report concluded, "While considered contrary to armoured force principles of speed, This system provides decisive advantage in bunker warfare. Recommendation: study for post-war assault tank application. The Westwall was not defeated in a single battle, it was burned out, one bunker at a time. When the last Crocodile withdrew to refuel near Aachen, the infantry it had protected lined the road to salute it. The tank crews, exhausted and blackened with soot, waved back. For the U.S. Army, the lesson of the Westwall was now beyond dispute. In the age of high explosives and fast armor, sometimes the oldest weapon of all fire was still the most effective. The Crocodiles rolled on eastward through the autumn rain, their trailers leaving thin tracks of soot and ash. Behind them lay a trail of silent bunkers, still smoking, their guns forever quiet. The Americans, who had once scoffed at the ungainly Churchill, now guarded them like gold. The tank they had rejected had melted Germany's fortress line and, with it, the last illusions of invincibility. The Ardennes forests in late 1944 were a place of mud, misery, and fear. The Americans called it the Green Hell. Rain turned to sleet, sleet to snow, and every step crunched on ice or detonated a mine. Trees shattered under artillery blasts, spraying splinters sharper than shrapnel. Men froze in foxholes, soaked and sleepless, while German pillboxes watched from the ridgelines. The Hürtgen forest became the costliest square of ground the U.S. Army ever fought for until fire came to thaw it. By November, the U.S. First Army was stalled. The objective was the Ruhr River, gateway to Cologne and the Rhine. But the Siegfried Line's western shoulder, an unbroken chain of bunkers from Vossenack to Schmidt, blocked every advance. Conventional methods had failed. Engineers cleared mines by hand. Artillery cratered the forest but left the bunkers untouched. "We shelled until the guns overheated," wrote Lieutenant Bill Grady of the 28th Infantry Division, "but they kept shooting back. You couldn't see them, only the muzzle flash." Then, through the fog, came shapes the Americans recognized now like saints in a stained-glass church, squat, steel, and trailing armored cylinders. Churchill Crocodiles of the British 79th Armored Division, attached to support the U.S. 4th and 28th Infantry Divisions. The Crocodiles' crews were veterans of Normandy and Aachen, accustomed to mud, but even they hesitated at Hürtgen's terrain. Tracks slid on ice, and trees closed over the narrow trails like black ribs. A single German shell could fell a pine across a tank's path. You could hear the trunks breaking, Corporal Alf Jenkins recalled, like bones snapping in the dark. Yet the Churchills pressed on, engines low-geared, each yard a fight. On the 18th of November, 1944, at the village of Vossenack, 2 Crocodiles joined Company F of the 12th Infantry Regiment in clearing a ridge bristling with bunkers. American bazooka teams had failed to breach them for 3 days. At 0900, the British tank commander ordered, "Open flame." The projector hissed a line of fire, streaked 30 yards, and curled around the concrete embrasure. The heat was so intense the snow flashed into steam. When the smoke cleared, German voices were shouting, "Kamerad! Kamerad!" Captain Donald L. Day's field report, written that evening, was clinical. 2 bunkers neutralized in 6 minutes, no friendly casualties. Recommend integration of flame tanks in all Siegfried operations. What the Crocodiles brought was not just fire, but psychological dominance. Infantry, who had spent weeks clawing forward yards at a time, suddenly had a weapon that made the impossible routine. Private First Class George Ulrich of the 22nd Infantry recalled, "Before the Crocs, you had to crawl up with a satchel charge and pray. After, you just watched the flame do it for you." The Germans didn't fight, they screamed. Even hardened officers began to grasp the moral shift. Colonel Charles L. Lanham, commanding the 22nd Infantry, noted, "These tanks alter not only the battlefield but the soldier's mind. Our men advance behind fire with a confidence I've never seen before." For the Germans, it was the opposite. Captured diaries from the 275th Infantry Division contained lines like, "We fear the flamethrower tanks more than the artillery." One entry, found on a dead Feldwebel near Schmidt, read simply, "The fire comes and we are nothing." By December, the Allies had fought the forest to a standstill. The Crocodiles were called again for the next stage, the crossing of the Ruhr River. German engineers had flooded the valley, turning it into a swamp. American divisions faced rows of fortified towns, Linnich, Jülich, Düren, each a miniature fortress. In this landscape of ruin, the Crocodile became indispensable. At Linnich, January 1945, one troop of Crocodiles supported the 405th Infantry. The tanks advanced through knee-deep mud, their flame jets marking the fog like lightning. Each burst illuminated wrecked houses and twisted wire. The flame clung to wet brick and crept into basements where defenders hid. In one engagement, 40 German soldiers surrendered from a schoolhouse after the first burst struck the outer wall. An American observer wrote, "They came out choking before the fire even reached them." At Jülich, the story repeated, the Crocodiles reduced 20 pillboxes in a single day, losing only one tank to mechanical failure. The town fell within 48 hours faster than any planner had dared hope. A G3 operations note from XIX Corps captured the transformation: flame weapons, once viewed as limited or experimental, now essential for assault on fortified localities. By February 1945, the Crocodiles had done more than burn out bunkers, they had saved lives. Combat medical records tell a quiet story. Casualty rates among assault companies dropped by up to 60% when flame tanks were present. Engineers used Crocodile flame bursts to clear suspected minefields, burning off underbrush and exposing wire. Even medics followed their advance. A burned landscape was safer than one laced with traps. And yet, the crews paid for every victory. Their tanks drew fire like magnets. The Germans learned to aim for the fuel trailer, calling it Feuertopf, the fire pot. One direct hit could turn a Crocodile into a funeral pyre. Crewman Tom Whittle later said, "We all knew what we were hauling, but we also knew the infantry was counting on us. That was enough." When winter broke in February, the Crocodiles stood at the Ruhr, their steel skins blackened, their paint blistered from their own heat. They had burned a path through forest, stone, and fear. What began as a British secret had become an Allied necessity. In the snow-choked valleys and flooded plains of Germany's frontier, the U.S. Army learned what every British Crocodile crew already knew. Fire was not cruelty, it was the only way through. As spring approached and the Rhine beckoned beyond, the Crocodiles would move again, this time into cities. The tank America once rejected was now their most feared and faithful ally. By March 1945, the war in Europe had turned into a siege of cities. Cologne, Westwall, Essen, and the Ruhr Valley, each name was synonymous with concrete, steel, and fanatic resistance. Germany's last army stood not on open fields but inside factories, basements, and fortified intersections. The Siegfried Line had fallen, yet the Germans had turned every industrial ruin into a fortress. For the men of the US 1st and 9th Armies, the nightmare was just beginning. When American patrols entered the outskirts of Cologne on March 5, they found the streets mined, the bridges blown, and every intersection covered by interlocking fire from anti-tank guns hidden among rubble. The 3rd Armoured Division's Shermans advanced cautiously behind bulldozers and infantry, their commanders expecting another meat grinder. What they didn't expect were the same British tanks that had burned out the Westwall now standing at the Rhine's edge. Waiting for orders, the Churchill Crocodiles of the 79th Armoured Division attached once again to support US operations in urban warfare. The Crocodile's baptism in Cologne came at dawn on the 6th of March 1945, near the Hohenzollern Bridge. American infantry from the 36th Armoured Infantry Regiment had been pinned down by a fortified apartment block overlooking the bridge approaches. The Germans' paratroopers of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment fought from reinforced basements and upper floors, firing Panzerfausts from shattered windows. At 0800, 2 Crocodiles advanced through the smoke, their engines growling in low gear. The first burst of flame shot from the lead tank, arcing across 100 feet of open street and vanishing through a window. A heartbeat later, fire erupted from every aperture of the building. The paratroopers' resistance collapsed. Some leaped from the upper floors to escape the heat. Others staggered out with their forms smouldering. Within 5 minutes, the block was silent. Colonel John Bowles of the 3rd Armoured Division filed a terse report. Crocodile flame tanks extremely effective in city fighting. Enemy resistance broken with minimal infantry loss. Recommend permanent attachment of flame units for assault on urban strongpoints. The Crocodiles moved methodically through Cologne's ruins, reducing one strongpoint after another. Their advance was slow, 10 miles in 4 days, but decisive. American infantry followed close, rifles lowered, as if protected by fire itself. A soldier from the 36th later wrote home, "They said tanks can't fight in cities. I saw one today that burned a whole block in 2 minutes. We didn't lose a man taking it." By mid-March, Allied armies stood along the Rhine from Remagen to Westwall. The river that Hitler had promised would be Germany's shield had become a trap. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had fallen intact, and American troops were pouring across. To the north, the British Second Army prepared to cross at Westwall under the cover of night, and with them, hidden among the armour of Hobart's 79th, were the Crocodiles. On March 23, Operation Plunder began. The Rhine crossing was the largest amphibious assault since D-Day. British and American engineers built pontoon bridges under artillery fire, while flame tanks silenced enemy guns on the far bank. The Crocodiles led the way through the floodplain, jets of fire illuminating the night sky like orange lightning. German positions along the dikes disintegrated under the assault. One German prisoner later told interrogators, "We thought hell itself had crossed the river." Within 48 hours, the Rhine had been breached. General Montgomery's staff recorded that flame tanks proved invaluable in securing bridgeheads against dug-in resistance. The Crocodile's performance so impressed U.S. commanders that 9th Army staff officers requested their retention for the Ruhr campaign. The request was granted. The Ruhr Valley, industrial heart of Germany, became the Allies' next objective. Here, resistance was fiercest, not from regular troops, but from Volkssturm militia, Hitler Youth, and desperate remnants of shattered divisions. They defended factories, rail yards, and cellars with fanatical resolve. Yet for every bunker and machine gun nest, there was now a counter-Crocodile flame. At Essen, home of the Krupp Works, the Crocodiles fought street to street alongside the 2nd Armoured Division. Their thick armour shrugged off small arms fire. Their flame turned fortified workshops into molten tombs. The Americans began calling them the Dragons. In Gelsenkirchen, one Crocodile advanced down a rail embankment under direct artillery fire, its trailer struck twice by 75mm shells. The crew kept going. When they reached the target bunker, they unleashed a 40-second burst of flame that engulfed the entrance. 90 German soldiers surrendered within minutes. The psychological effect was total. Captured German officers admitted that orders to hold were often ignored once Crocodiles appeared. "It is not a tank," one major told Allied interrogators. "It is a firestorm on tracks." By mid-April, the Ruhr pocket had collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers surrendered, their uniforms scorched, their morale broken. The Crocodiles had done their grim work, fighting not for speed or glory, but for annihilation of resistance. In total, they reduced more than 300 fortified positions during the Rhine-Ruhr campaign. When victory came in May, the Crocodile crews were among the few British soldiers still operating under U.S. command. Their tanks, once ridiculed as obsolete, had become the indispensable key to victory in the fortress cities of Germany. General Omar Bradley's final assessment was blunt. The British assault tanks, particularly the Churchill Flame tanks, proved the only effective counter to heavy fortifications. Their value to U.S. operations cannot be overstated. And so, as Germany burned and surrendered, the weapon America had once rejected had become its silent partner in victory. The Crocodiles parked along the Ruhr were blackened, their paint blistered by their own heat, but their steel hearts had endured. Fire had conquered concrete. The ugly British tank had become the torch that lit the road to Berlin. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a landscape of ruin, and among the wreckage stood the blackened hulks of machines that had carried the Allies from Normandy to the Rhine. Some were sleek, some were fast, but one in particular stood out. The squat, battle-scarred Churchill tank, still streaked with soot and dried mud. Once mocked by American officers as obsolete, it had become their indispensable ally in the crucible of fortress warfare. At depots across the British and American zones, engineers catalogued the survivors. Of the 306 Churchill Crocodiles deployed in northwest Europe, more than half bore visible battle scars. Many had fought through 4 major campaigns: Normandy, Brittany, the Westwall, and the Ruhr, without being knocked out. Their crews, weary and deaf from months of combat, treated the tanks almost like living comrades. "She saved more Yanks than I can count," Sergeant Tom Whittle said, patting the armour of his Crocodile Boadicea. "Ugly old girl, but she never quit." Ironically, the Churchills' legend was born from rejection. In 1941, the U.S. Army had inspected early Churchill prototypes and dismissed them as anachronisms, too heavy, too slow, too complex. America's new armor doctrine favored the agile Sherman and the emerging concept of the fast cruiser tank. The M6 heavy tank project was cancelled, and the U.S. Army declared that firepower and maneuver, not brute protection, would win the war. But war, as it often does, had other lessons to teach. The campaigns of 1943 and 1944 revealed that Europe was not a battlefield of open plains. It was a continent of towns, hedgerows, and fortresses. The tanks that survived were not the fastest, but the toughest. In the ruins of Cayenne, at Brest, and again in the forests of Germany, the Churchills' combination of armour, torque, and specialised weapons had filled a role the Americans had never built for. When the U.S. Army's Ordnance Board reviewed combat reports in late 1945, one memo classified, secret at the time, summarized the revelation: the Churchill heavy tank, particularly the Crocodile variant, represents an idealized form of the assault tank concept prematurely abandoned by this office in 1942. Experience demonstrates that massed firepower and protection have greater tactical value than speed in urban and fortified environments. Postwar technical evaluations by the U.S. Army Ground Forces Board at Fort Knox confirmed what the battlefield had already proven. A single Churchill Crocodile was tested against a mock fortification built of reinforced concrete. The result? Complete destruction of the target in under 2 minutes. The flame projector achieves results disproportionate to size or fuel capacity, one American officer noted. Psychological shock multiplies its physical effect. U.S. engineers studied the design carefully. Reports in 1946 describe the Crocodile's trailer coupling system, pressure-fed projector, and ignition apparatus in detail. The Americans began experimenting with flamethrower systems mounted on Sherman chassis, leading to the M4A3R3 Zippo, used in the Pacific and later in Korea. The concept, directly inspired by the British Crocodile, became a cornerstone of post-war flame warfare. Meanwhile, the Churchill's legacy extended beyond its terrifying weapon. The tank's thick armour and flexible suspension influenced future U.S. designs. Engineers at Detroit Arsenal, working on the T-29 and T-30 heavy tank prototypes, borrowed heavily from British experience with assault vehicles. One internal memo dated November 1946 stated, "Churchill-type armour distribution and component redundancy provide superior survivability under heavy fire. Recommend incorporation into new heavy tank program." In peacetime, the Crocodile became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of Allied ingenuity. At parades in London, Brussels, and even New York, captured German officers reportedly stared in silence as crocodiles rumbled past, their trailers empty but ominous. At the 1946 Berlin Victory Review, an American colonel remarked, "The men who laughed at these in 42 now salute them." The bond between British and American soldiers forged in fire endured as well. Veterans of the 79th Armored Division and the U.S. 2nd and 8th Infantry Divisions held joint reunions throughout the late 1942. They traded patches, photographs, and stories of Brest, Aachen, and the Westwall. Many remembered not just the machine, but its crews. They didn't talk much, recalled one U.S. private, but when you saw that dragon head painted on a Churchill coming up behind you, you knew you were going home alive. In 1950, as war flared again in Korea, American armor officers reviewed European records for lessons. Among the highlighted items in their study was the Crocodile's performance in urban and fortified terrain. The Army's FM 17-10 Armored Force Operations Manual was quietly amended to include a new doctrine. The use of specialized armored vehicles for assault against fortifications is essential to minimize infantry losses. The words could have been written straight from the battlefields of Brest. The Crocodile's reign as a frontline tank ended with the war, but its concept lived on in flamethrower tanks used in Korea, in the heavy assault vehicles of the Cold War, and in the doctrine of combined arms warfare. When the last Churchill Crocodiles were done and retired from British service in 1951, many were donated to museums. One now sits at the National Army Museum in Bovington, its thick armour still pitted with scars. Another rests in a quiet field near Bastogne, left as a memorial by the townspeople it helped liberate. In the end, the tank that the U.S. Army had dismissed as a relic became the unsung weapon that cracked Hitler's Atlantic Wall, melted the Westwall, and burned the fortress cities of the Reich to their knees. It was never the fastest, nor the prettiest, but in the end, it was the one that endured. As British historian David Fletcher wrote decades later, the Churchill was the last of the old-school tanks, a fortress on tracks. The Americans called it too slow. The Germans called it unstoppable. History called it necessary. From rejection to reverence, from mockery to legend, the Churchill had the last word. In the years after the Second World War, the thunder of engines gave way to silence. The Churchill tanks were parked in long, rusting rows on depots across England, France, and occupied Germany's steel giants, cooling under foreign skies. The men who had driven them went home, traded their flame goggles for farm tools and factory overalls. The world, eager to forget its infernos, turned its attention to reconstruction, to new wars, to the jet age. But buried in the archives of two nations lay the story of a revolution, one born not of elegance or speed, but of stubborn endurance and brutal practicality. Army wrote its first post-war tactical manuals in 1946. The word flamethrower appeared less and less. The atomic bomb and jet aircraft promised a cleaner, more strategic kind of warfare, or so the planners thought. Heavy armor was out of fashion. Flexibility and speed were the new creed. Yet, buried in the appendix of Field Manual 17-10 was a quiet acknowledgement. The Crocodile-type flame tank remains the most effective weapon yet devised against fortified positions. Few officers read that line. Fewer still understood what it meant. The new generation of tankers had not been to Brest or Aachen. They had not seen a bunker crack open under fire. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, it was the older veterans men who had fought beside crocodiles who remembered. At Seoul and the Pusan perimeter, American engineers hastily resurrected the concept, mounting flamethrowers on Shermans. The reports from the field were eerily familiar. High psychological impact, immediate enemy withdrawal, minimal friendly casualties. The lessons of 1944 had returned, uninvited but undeniable. Yet the Crocodile itself was gone. Britain, drained by war debts and shifting to nuclear deterrence, retired the last operational Churchill flame tanks in 1951. A few were sold to France, where they saw brief use in Indochina before being scrapped. Others were left in depots to rust, forgotten relics of a war most preferred not to remember in detail. In the early 1962, a quiet movement began among military historians and engineers who had lived through the war. At the Royal Armoured Corps Centre in Bovington, retired officers began cataloguing wartime designs. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel Donald Taylor, a former Crocodile troop commander. His 1964 report, Assault Tanks and the Future Battlefield, argued that modern warfare would again require slow, protected vehicles to breach fortified terrain. In a nuclear age, Taylor wrote, the battlefield will once more be a maze of bunkers. We shall need our Churchills again, though by other names. Across the Atlantic, US. Engineers studying the lessons of Vietnam would come to the same conclusion. Jungle warfare, like fortress warfare, demanded armored endurance over speed. A 1968 Pentagon study on heavy assault vehicle design cited the Crocodile by name as the most psychologically potent ground weapon of the Second World War. The study's author, Colonel James A. Roberts, was blunt in his conclusion. We abandoned the assault tank concept too soon. Every generation of warfare rediscovers the need for a machine that can survive what infantry cannot. In 1974, the Imperial War Museum restored a Churchill Crocodile for public display. The crew compartment was rebuilt, its flame projector polished, its armor plates still showing the dents of battle. Visitors who saw it for the first time were startled by its size, taller than a man, heavy as an artillery piece, trailing a drum of steel like some prehistoric beast. But veterans who visited stood quietly before it. At the museum's dedication, one elderly American infantryman, Private George Ulrich of the 22nd Infantry, placed his hand on the tank's side and whispered, "That's the one that got us through the forest." His son later said he had never seen his father cry before. By the 1982nd, historians began to reappraise the Churchill's place in armor evolution. The Smithsonian's 1985 Symposium on the Machines That Won the War devoted an entire session to the Crocodile. U.S. Air Force historian Daniel Hallman summed it up best. The tank the Americans refused to build became the tank they could not fight without. Today, only a handful of Crocodiles remain. One sits at the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Museum at Fort Benning, an unlikely guest among the Shermans and Pershings. Another stands in Normandy, its paint fading under the sea air, yet its name still legible on the hull, Dragon. Tourists pose beside it, unaware that this ungainly beast once broke the strongest fortress line in Europe. In the age of drones and digital targeting, the Crocodile seems an antique, but its lessons endure. Every modern assault vehicle, whether the U.S. Marine Corps' M1A1 with urban breaching gear or the Israeli IDF's flame-equipped D9 bulldozers, carries its genetic imprint. Fire, armor, and endurance remain eternal currencies in war. In the archives of the U.S. National Defense University, a 1993 study on urban warfare systems opens with a single quote from a 1945 German officer's interrogation. The British flame tank was not a weapon. It was an act of God. The US Army never built another Churchill. It didn't need to, the lesson had already been learned in blood and flame. Sometimes the best weapon is the one you first refuse to believe in. And so, in the quiet halls of museums and the fading memories of the last veterans, the rejected tank still burns its fire, now a memory, but its legacy immortal.